This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. JD Vance is Donald Trump's running mate, and he's the senator from Ohio. But he is a newcomer on the political scene. And so, as such, a lot of people don't know very much about his ideas or what he is about himself. And that is concerning because JD Vance actually comes from a reactionary far right tradition that is explicitly and fundamentally at odds with American democracy. Donald Trump, by contrast, has no core ideology and no core beliefs. His main goal at all times and all places is to advance his own personal interests, and that is literally it. But Vance is different. He comes from an authoritarian, reactionary tradition that explicitly rejects conservatism, liberalism, and democracy. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about that tradition and how old it is and some of the core ideas of this tradition and why it is very, very concerning whether JD Vance wins in the election or not. And my guest on today's episode is Matt McManus. He is the author of a book called The Political Right and Equality, Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity. And he is a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan. And joining me now is Matt McManus. Welcome to Theory of Change, Matt.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
All right. Yeah. So we have a lot to talk about here today. The political philosophy episodes are always one of my favorites, I have to confess, as my audience may already realize. But nonetheless, so JD Vance, we're kind of organizing the discussion here of reactionism and reactionary politics around him, because I think he is, very obviously the most prominent reactionary figure now in the United States. And I will come back to Vance later. But so the idea first I want to explore is that conservatism and reactionism are not the same
Mhm.
political philosophies. They're very obviously adjacent and contiguous, but they're very different from each other. And you have written quite a bit about reactionism and conservatism. And so let's maybe start the discussion off with that. What are the fundamental differences between conservatism and reactionary?
Sure. Well, I think the important thing to note right from the get go is that the political right broadly is a vast and extremely diverse area of political
Yeah.
ideologies. It includes everything from fascists to moderate conservatives like Mitt Romney, and arguably quite a few liberals would identify on the political right as well. You know, people like F.A. Hayek, et cetera, et cetera. So, at the core of being right wing, I think is Hayek's idea that you believe that there are recognizably superior persons within society and that those recognizably superior persons are entitled to more, right? More wealth, more power, more status. And generally aligned with this is a kind of moral view that if we have recognizably superior persons in positions of authority and positions of status, everything will go better for everyone else because you want power and you want status and you want wealth to accrue in the hands of those who are best exercised to wield it. Who happens to be a recognizably superior person, how you make these kind of determinations, that's where a lot of the enormous nuance and variation on the political right comes from. Now, one of the things that distinguishes conservatives from reactionaries is generally speaking, conservatives tend to think that the traditional hierarchies and authority structures that have been present in society for a very long period of time are the ones that we should put our faith in for, again, a variety of different reasons. But let's just point to like the Burkean tradition, right? A good Burkean would say, and this is putting it a bit simply, the reason we should put our faith in authority structures and hierarchies that have endured over a long period of time is because if they've endured for a long period of time, then they seem to be working reasonably well, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, that doesn't mean we can't tinker around the edges with things, but the main goal of a conservative is to change what must be changed in order to conserve what we can. And in the contemporary American scene right now, you still see a variety of different people on the right who hold this view. George Will comes to mind. He wrote a big book called The Conservative Sensibility, where he kind of fused Burkean and more classical liberal ideas to say, look, in the United States, we're fundamentally a classical liberal country. The founders were classical liberals. So the job of a kind of conservative in America is to conserve and to advance classical liberal principles and institutions like those that the founders created. But that's not the outlook that many of America's reactionaries hold today. Many American reactionaries are fundamentally opposed to the liberal worldview for, again, a wide variety of different reasons. And this includes people like Vance, who's drank deep of the well of post liberal and anti liberal thought. And the goal of these figures is, in the words of Glenn Elmers, to not conserve anything, right? Conservatism is no longer enough, as the title of one of Elmer's essays went, because fundamentally, liberalism has been a destructive force. It's wiped out everything that's of value in the United States. And so, what we need to do, if you're a reactionary, of course, is to advance a much more militant and even revolutionary or counter revolutionary program to try to set things right.
Yeah, there are significant differences, and you've described them well. That yeah, conservatives, a conservative in the American sense, and broadly speaking, maybe global sense at this point now is somebody who wants to conserve liberalism as it is, or maybe perhaps just recently was. That's what a conservative is,
Mhm,
and a reactionary is somebody who says, liberalism is wrong, and in many cases, democracy is wrong as
mhm,
well. And when we'll get further into that in the discussion here today. But so with Vance, um, he has a lot of connections to all of these emergent reactionaries, and
mhm,
it's been kind of just both fascinating and dispiriting how a lot of political professionals, including people who are Democratic Party strategists and communicators and professional national journalists, they don't seem to understand this difference between
mhm.
conservatism and reactionism. Now, why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are a number of different reasons, right? One is that the American right for a very long time has presented itself as fundamentally a conservative movement, right? Committed to at least market liberalism, a fair degree of individual freedom, and certainly the promotion of democracy around the globe. Think back to the advent of Reaganism, right? Where a lot of those kinds of tropes were put together. Now, if you're a critic of the American right, that's more longstanding, like myself, you might question the sincerity of a lot of those convictions, but that's at least the way that it's been presented, right? Um, this kind of overtly reactionary, anti-liberal, kind of muscularly counter-revolutionary outlook um, has come as quite a shock to a variety of different pundits, including many right-wing pundits, people like Jonah Goldberg, who were surprised, by what seems to have come out of the Republican Party. Now, I would argue again that if you look deeper into the history of American conservatism, people like Rick Perlstein would say all these kinds of ingredients for a counter-revolutionary program were always there, right? If you go back to something like Barry Goldwater's campaign in 1964, right? Goldwater probably lost that election in no small part, not just because he was soft on civil rights and even opposed to civil rights, but because he said things like, radicalism in defense of liberty or extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, right? It's not really a very conservative attitude endorsing these kinds of extremist views. But, generally speaking, this tended to be a rhetorically quiescent element of the right until comparatively recently. Definitely, it was less transparent before 2016 when Trump gave license to a lot of these people to become a lot more vocal.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and it was both a rebranding exercise as well on the part of the people that were saying, well, we're in favor of liberalism. I mean, for instance, obviously, William F. Buckley, he presented as that being his brand of, well, I'm just trying to conserve what we have in this country, and but at the same time, he was saying that he was also being in favor of segregation writing editorials saying that, well, actually, segregation is good because Black people are just not capable of governing themselves and being part of the economy. So this is for their own good. Sorry, guys, you just SJWs are wrong. You need to leave it as it is. And
Yeah,
and he
or
wrote a
even
book.
give another example. During the at
Yeah.
the height of the AIDS epidemic, William F. Buckley recommended that homosexuals, his term, be tattooed above the buttocks, right, with a big warning label, right, and that kind of humor, let's call it that, wouldn't be out of place in something like the contemporary Trump movement, with this kind of vulgarity and it's just rote and callous dismissal of human life. So again, I think if you look
Mhm.
back further and look more carefully at some of these figures, we kind of view the past of American conservatism with rose-colored glasses if we don't recognize that a lot of the seeds of Trumpism were very firmly planted well before he came onto the scenes.
Yeah. And then also the fact that, I mean, the entire movement, which began calling itself conservatism, I mean, they didn't call themselves conservative. Like, that's an important point, which, because most, political professionals, journalistic professionals don't know anything about history, that they don't realize that Buckley and these other people, I mean, the point of what they were doing was to stop the New Deal, was to roll back Social Security, was to roll back, labor unions and minimum wage. Like, that was always the goal. Like, and they've never stopped having those goals. And so, yeah, it's pretty disgraceful, frankly, that a lot of people who pretend to be experts and put themselves forward as experts don't know any of this stuff. Pretty disgraceful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, once upon a time, the right, certainly the intellectual American right, used to be described as a three-legged stool, right? Uh, one leg of that stool was militant anti-communism, which eventually transformed into this idea that America should have a kind of militant and muscular international relations policy in the 1990s and early 2000s when communism, for the most part, disappeared. The second leg of the stool was the evangelical Christian movement, which always had a very, very, very pronounced kind of white nationalist undercurrent to it, with its opposition to things like civil rights, alongside, of course, more conventional kinds of oppositions to things like abortion or gay marriage. And then the third leg of that stool were American libertarians, certainly right libertarians at the very least, who, as you mentioned, were committed to rolling back the New Deal, or even going further than rolling back the New Deal, going all the way back to invert something like the criticisms of the Lochner precedent from early in the 20th century. And as a lot of people have pointed out, the three legs of this stool were never exactly the same size, and the stool itself was always kind of shaky, since it's not immediately clear uh, what economic libertarianism or economic liberalism has to do with support for white evangelicism, let alone the idea that America should use its military and cultural might to try to impose its value system, whatever that happens to be around the globe. Again, what I would argue is that the shared through line of all these doctrines or all these elements of the classical American right was this conviction that there are superior people and superior countries, for that matter, and they're entitled to greater status, greater agency, and they were hostile to a liberalism which suggested otherwise.
Yeah. And I think that probably one of the other reasons that this distinction is harder for a lot of people to grasp is that these early branders and influencers for reactionism, like Buckley, they did explicitly market their ideas in the language of liberalism, because Nazism had so, overwhelmingly discredited fascism and authoritarianism as political philosophies in the recent memory of the people they were trying to convince.
Absolutely right. So David Austin Walsh has written a very good book about this, so I'm going to draw pretty heavily from that. So arguably, the kind of unifying philosophy that was characteristic of the National Review crowd for a long time was Frank Breyer's fusionism, right? For those in your audience who aren't familiar with it, fusionism refers to this idea that we should combine a commitment to classical liberal liberties, certainly economic liberties, with this commitment to Judeo Christian virtues and Judeo Christian norms. Uh, Now, again, this fusion of a commitment to a kind of social conservatism with a kind of liberalism, certainly an economic liberalism, was uncomfortable, even in Meyer's work. And there were enormous debates amongst the National Review crowd about which axes of this fusionist synthesis they should emphasize, right? Because people quite rightly pointed out that if you're committed to things like liberal values, there seems to be something contradictory in calling for banning pornography, for example. And if you're an economic liberal, there seems to be something very unusual about aligning yourself with people who say things like, we should ban pornography or we should ban gambling or whatever it happens to be.
Mm.
But I would argue,
Prayer in school. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. I would argue, following a lot of historians, that this is where the third leg of the stool came in. Despite all of these various differences, and some of these debates were really quite intense and bluntly nasty. If you look at the Meyer-Kirk debate, for example, they were not nice to each other. Um, a lot of them were papered over because the one thing the American right could absolutely agree on was that communism, socialism, understood very expansively, were bad things and extremely threatening. Oftentimes, they lumped the New Deal in with that, since or the Great Society programs of Johnson. And there's nothing like an enemy to kind of bring strange bedfellows together and allow a synthesis intellectually, like fusionism, to function as a kind of ad hoc philosophy for a long period of time. And some people have pointed out that one of the reasons why the splits on the American right became more transparent as time went on is because without a international adversary like the Soviet Union to kind of band everyone together, instead the American right started turning on more domestic enemies, which of course leads to more existential questions about just what American conservatism is supposed to be and which elements of American society don't really belong.
Yeah, and I would think that that sort of foreign policy component is probably what kept the other two from going off the complete deep end and embracing their inherent radicalism because, it was run by the military industrial complex and their, and their advocates within the Republican Party that, you know, by definition, they need a stable society, and as much as militaries in many countries, are forces for right wing authoritarianism, they also in many countries do have an inherent apolitical mission, and very often do, in fact, are can be a force for some sort of moderation within between different warring factions.
Absolutely, and I mean, there's no denying this, right? There are plenty of people within the Reagan administration, people like Buchanan or Sam Francis, who were a lot more hostile to liberalism and arguably even American democracy than they let on. But there was an awareness on the part of many of the Reaganites that in an existential battle with world communism, where communism had quite a bit of appeal to many in the third world, it was extremely important to position oneself as a defender of freedom, a defender of democracy, a defender of national self determination in some circumstances, right? And again, a lot of that disappeared with the end of communism in, depending on when you want to date it, the late 1980s, early 1990s, right? As a kind of world historical force. And again, nothing really unites like a good enemy, especially internationally. Without that, it just leads you to turn inwards and reflect upon one's internal differences in a much more existentially stringent kind of way.
Yeah, and have to actually start developing your real ideas and your real values, which apparently have been pretty much. Um,
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people have talked about Pat Buchanan's early runs in the 1990s, and you can read Buchanan's books. He anticipates a lot of the kind of philosophy, if you want to call it that, of Trumpism that later emerges. But one of the reasons that Buchanan felt that there was this opportunity to run on a more stridently right wing kind of program in the 1990s is precisely because he felt, look, communism is gone, and the biggest untapped electorate in America, as he put it, is to the right of Ronald Reagan. And now that we don't necessarily have to worry about trying to appeal to all the left wingers and appeal to all the people outside of the United States who might be concerned about us pivoting too far to the right, it's time to tap that resource. So it's a very interesting thesis. And again, who knows what would have happened if the Soviet Union hadn't fallen? Definitely, we wouldn't have seen something like Trumpism right now.
yeah, I think so. There is an irony also in the rise of reactionism or fascism, whatever you want to call it, in the United States. It is in many ways kind of the indirect creation of neoconservatism.
Mhm.
And it's very ironic because the neoconservatives were the very first people who were expelled once the Trump people took over the Republican Party.
And they've never
And
forgiven him for it, that's for sure.
yeah, and so but the neoconservatives, as much as they hate Trump and hate this kind of fascistic form of politics that he's created, this reactionary viewpoint, in a lot of ways, they were the predecessors for it, and you talk about that in your book. So let's discuss that further, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I still think that the definitive book on the relationship between, say, the Bush administration, second Bush administration, and the Trump administration has yet to be written. But as you point out, many of the neoconservatives who kind of reached the apex of their influence and their power during the Bush administration deeply resented the Trump administration sidelining them and just pushing them out and tried to present Trump as some kind of aberration from what the Republican Party once stood for. Think about somebody like David Frum, right, who basically writes op-ed after op-ed in the Atlantic, make exactly this case week in and week out. I would argue that that is a misconstrual of the real history. So, look, neoconservatism emerged as a kind of distinct strand of conservatism that began to gain real influence in the 1980s in the in the Reagan administration. There's no doubt that many neoconservatives transitioned from the left, even from communism. If you think about somebody like Irving Kristol, who was once a Trotskyite, towards a kind of classical liberalism with some conservative values. But this has led many people to misdiagnose neoconservatism as fundamentally a form of liberalism in the clothes of a kind of conservative outlook. I don't think that that's true. I think that if you look deeper into the text of many leading neoconservatives, it's very clear that they hold conservative views about a wide array of issues. Uh, you know, Irving Kristol himself had a variety of different social conservative outlooks on things like homosexuality, or you can take something like the Project for the New American Century that released a important document in the 2000s that was actually quite upset at the fact that America had won the Cold War. Now, this can seem odd, but what's articulated in this document is this deep fear that with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States is going to adopt an isolationist path, demilitarize, and this is going to lead to on the right is typically called decadence. Right? Americans are just going to focus on mindless consumerism, choosing which refrigerator to put into their kitchen, and they're not going to dedicate themselves to bigger and more grand projects of the sorts that the neoconservatives found extremely attractive and extremely exciting and necessary in order to retain America's influence in the world. And not surprisingly, when the 2001 terror attack took place, many of them said, "Well, here's our moment. We have a new enemy. We have a grand imperial project that we can use to elevate society above this kind of decadent, libertine, liberal outlook that they've associated with things like the Clinton administration." And think about somebody like Karl Rove, who, in a New York Times interview in the mid 2000s, it's allegedly Karl Rove, I should say, said things like, "All of you people in the fact-based community will sit there and say that what we're doing is wrong or it's not based on the facts, but we're an empire now, and we create our own reality." Oh, sorry, not the fact-based community, the reality-based community. We create our
Yeah.
own reality now, and all of you are just going to sit there and bear witness to what we do and chronicle it. Uh, that's very
Mhm.
much a kind of Trumpy outlook, right? This idea that decadent libertinism and permissiveness is going to lead to the decline of American society. What we need instead are things and projects that are big and exciting and vital to elevate the masses above the stupor that they inexorably fall into. And combined with that is this ambivalence and even hostility towards the reality based community or the fact based community for pointing out that a lot of these grand projects are going to end in disaster, which is, of course, what eventually happened with the Bush administration, because they're not interested in those kind of things. They're interested in the excitement and the grandeur that they associate with these ideas. And of course, very much like Trumpism, neoconservatism found out that the reality of its program, when implemented, was a lot more banal and a lot more disastrous than they'd ever anticipated. And that's probably why the movement went the way of the dinosaurs and deserved it.
Yeah. Well, and this idea of decadence, I mean, that is really kind of it is a fundamental belief across all right wing philosophies. With this, in addition to being, the superior people, what makes people superior is their lack of decadence, and their and this harkens back, even if the people saying it don't realize it, it harkens back, to the ancient Greek ideal of arete, or as it's commonly rendered as virtue. Um, and like the people who are excellent, people will not be excellent unless they are forced to be excellent
Mhm.
by external circumstances or by the government forcing them into better behavior or better thinking, or what something has to force people to be better, because otherwise they're horrible and stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. And this anxiety about potential decadence, understood, I should say, in a huge variety of different ways, is pretty common across a wide array of right wing views. And most right wing intellectuals will proffer theories of decadence and decline in one way or another. And they'll also, of course, offer solutions. And this can be true even of what we might call more moderate conservatives, people like, say, Edmund Burke, right? Uh, Many people associate Edmund Burke with the defense of things like, again, moderate conservatism, uh, capitalism, this idea that we can engage in incremental change, um, but we shouldn't kind of rock the boat too much, much of which is true. But I think if you look deeper in his book, uh, there's a lot of anxieties about barbers, for example, getting too much power in political society because what they do is just mundane and banal, and a barber doesn't need political power. And associated with that is the idea that what one needs in order to elevate a society and to attach people to systems of authority is to ascribe what he calls sublime qualities onto one's rulers and to the projects that those rulers engage in. And what's very interesting about Burke is he never says that the rulers actually need to possess these sublime qualities in themselves, since, of course, what constitutes the sublime is in the eye of the beholder. What's just important is that you project those kinds of ideals onto them. And that's something that somebody like Donald Trump would understand extremely well, right? In his book, The Art of the Deal, Trump says that he engages in what he calls truthful hyperbole, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms, but very Trumpy in that way. And he says, look, most people don't really think very big, but they do really admire and want to follow people who do think big. They want to believe that they are part of something that is the biggest and the most exciting and the most extravagant. And of course, Trump has applied exactly the same kind of attitude towards his politics, always presenting whatever he's doing as some kind of sublime renewal of the country, always associating himself with these kind of sublime qualities as the only person who can fix the country, and of course, serving as the knight of revenge for those who followed him. And again, there's a long-standing history of that in all permutations of right-wing thought, and every conservative is going to associate this need for sublime figures and authority figures in particular, and sublime projects with antidotes for the decadence that they see creeping in society as the masses and their vulgarity gain too much power.
Yeah, exactly. And related to that though, and it's ironic because as much as the philosophy, as the ideas, the philosophy, the rhetoric are fundamentally anti-democratic and authoritarian. They also are often treated and labeled as populist in a lot of the mainstream press, because, in fact, they do use and borrow, steal, whatever you want to say. They do, in fact, borrow a lot of rhetoric and tropes from social democratic or uh, communistic traditions,
Mhm.
critiques, and that was something that Sam Francis did. I think he was the one that kind of really injected a lot of that into the mainstream Republican discourse. Yeah, but there were other figures as well. Joe McCarthy obviously
Mhm.
is probably the most prominent early exemplar of that. But what's the um, I guess yeah. Let's maybe talk about first what you see as some of the most prominent examples of that in the history of this idea of these borrowings, and then maybe discuss, what, why people in the contemporary press are so unable to understand that this is not populism.
Sure. Well, I mean, anxieties about populism in democracy go all the way back to ancient Greece, right? Many of the ancient Greek philosophers were deeply concerned with the demagoguery they associated with loose figures like Alcibiades, right, who would say whatever they need to rile the people up to get what it is they want. And of course, the term populism comes from the Latin populares, which was expressed the kind of concerns in the Roman Republic about those who sided with the plebeians against the patricians. And a lot of this eventually contributed to the various civil wars that rocked the Republic in its late period. But in the contemporary era, right, people like Jan Mueller in his book, What is Populism, says that populism shouldn't be understood as being necessarily a left wing or a right wing phenomena. It's more kind of rhetorical and strategic style of politics where you set a pure and unadulterated people against a decadent and undeserving elite who've been in charge for far too long, and usually present yourself as the figure that can remove this decadence and replace the elite and set the country or set the the company or whatever it happens to be back on the right course. And there are left wing populists in the world. There's no doubt about it. Think about people like I know Almo in Mexico, right? Some people have even tried to make the case that somebody like Bernie Sanders falls into this paradigm. Although I'd reject that, since Sanders has always insisted that this movement is very much focused on the we rather than the I. Um, but in terms of the right, it's important to note that the political right worldwide initially emerged in part as a movement that was hostile to democracy and any kind of attempt to appeal to the people, because there was concerns that appealing to the people for support would cede a degree of political authority and political legitimacy to democratic projects. But starting around the 19th century, the most savvy conservative politicians and most savvy reactionary politicians realized that there was really no going back to the ancien regimes of Europe, where lords and kings could more or less just do whatever they want and the people just had to deal with it, right? The people have become a permanent constituent feature of modern political regimes. As they started to look very cleverly in many cases for ways to mobilize mass support for conservative projects. And they were very successful at it, as we see today, right? Now, one of the things that characterizes right wing populism uh, over and against left wing populism is left wing populism will typically present itself as agitating on behalf of people who have always and everywhere been denied political authority, social status, wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The dispossessed or the marginalized. Right wing populism usually moves in a much more nostalgic register, typically presenting itself as restoring to the people a degree of status, authority, and greatness that was once theirs and has been taken from them or corroded by the presence of liberal elites, the swinish multitude, and anyone else who's got a shot at power and status that they didn't really deserve. And Trump was, of course, a case in point with that, right? His premier slogan is "Make America Great Again." And so what he's really doing is tapping into this right populist sense that people have gotten a leg up who don't deserve it. This is in no small part the fault of liberal elites allied with the most undeserving people in society. This is exactly what Charlie Kirk, for example, argues in his book Right Wing Revolution. And Trump is going to restore to the people the status and authority over and above the undeserving that was wrongly taken from them. And of course, he is the only vessel that is capable of enacting this kind of restoration. And populism doesn't necessarily have to become anti democratic, although it very frequently does. But it's almost invariably anti liberal in the sense that populists resent the checks on state authority and on the leader's authority um, that any liberal would think is essential to a well-functioning democratic regime, and partly because there is this hostility to liberal checks and balances. It's very frequently the case, as Zach Beauchamp puts it in his book on the reactionary tradition, that populist movements will eventually swallow the democratic element of their program and just transform into outright authoritarian regimes.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think another difference between people who apply that label to themselves on the left and right is that for the right, when they claim to be the elites that they are attacking are not economic elites; they
Yep.
are intellectual elites. Like so. In other words, like for them, the bête noire is the university professor,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
yourself, or the fashion stylist in New York, or the feminist Instagram model. Those are the real elites in society in this rhetoric.
Yeah, and they're very transparent about that, right? Just to give an example, in Ron DeSantis's new book, or not new book, his last book, uh, Fire to a Failed Presidential Run, he tried to present himself as fighting against the elites. But he makes very clear in the book that an elite does not necessarily mean somebody who's reached the commanding heights of society. Clarence Thomas, billionaires, they aren't necessarily elites. An elite is somebody who shares in the worldview of liberalism, which means that if you're a school teacher in West Virginia earning $35,000 a year, but you want to talk about Black Lives Matters, from this DeSantis perspective, you're a part of the elite, but the Koch
Yeah.
brothers and Supreme Court judges aren't because they side with him, right? Now, this is, of
Yeah.
course, absurd by any metric. But again, this relates back to Mueller's point about populism. Uh, Populism isn't necessarily about trying to develop a consistent or logically plausible framework for understanding political reality. It's rhetorical and strategic, right? Uh, and DeSantis doesn't want to attack, and Trump does not want to attack the billionaire class. He wants to attack liberals. So it makes a lot of sense to them to frame elite status in this way rather than going after what I would think are the real elites in society, which are plutocrats, the very rich, uh, Fortune 500 companies, that kind of thing.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. And related to that is that this is, very much an epistemic revolution in a lot of ways to reactionary
Mhm.
complete takeover of the Republican Party, such that, and these borrowings that we're talking about here, they really are uh, basically taking from a tradition which is very incoherent, but the only real thing that it has is that you, the individual person, are always correct, and that the unnamed they, the people who control institutions or whatever, they are lying to you. They are controlling you. And so as such, as the graph we're showing on the screen shows that, these are our beliefs as you move further and further away from any sort of institutional trust, that they are features of Marxism. They are features of liberalism, religious democracy, conservatism, libertarianism. And then basically it kind of flips around to the other side there, that once you do not trust any other institutions, then only the individual great leader can come in and save you and save the society, which of course ends up in reactionism and fascism and Marxist totalitarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said about that, right? So let's just talk a little bit about right wing populism as an example. So John Gans points out in his really good book, again, When the Clock Broke, that there's a kind of oddity in some of the aesthetic tropes that you can find in Trumpism, at least a surface oddity, where a lot of times Trump's followers will like to characterize him as something like a gangster or a tough guy. You go to a Trump rally, you'll see him, on Scarface T-shirts or Godfather T-shirts, et cetera, et cetera. And Gantz points out that a lot of commentators have been bewildered by that because they'll say, "Well, aren't you the party of law and order? Aren't you supposed to believe in things like checks and balances on authority?" And that includes the authority of criminals, but of course the authority of politicians. And Gantz points out that that's a pretty silly way of understanding right wing populism. The appeal of people like Vito Corleone or Scarface, right, is precisely that they represent a different kind of authority to the one that, say, liberals would reverence, procedural and institutional authority. It represents this very masculine kind of authority figure who's not bound or checked by any kind of restrictions, but shows a degree of loyalty to those who follow him, doesn't really show a great deal of loyalty to everyone else, and is willing to do whatever it takes to advance those who follow him, the in group, over and against the out group who are conceived as enemies. And this, of course, has an enormous amount of appeal to the MAGA end of the political spectrum, and it always has. And there's deep rooted reasons for that. But there are antecedents in the political right as well. If you look at, say, the fascist movements of the early 20th century, and we can debate whether Trump is a fascist or not, one of the things that was consistently criticized by fascist intellectuals was the kind of slow, ponderous, dull, decadent, and nebbish nebbish quality that they associated with the talk shop of liberal parliamentarianism. And they said a leader will cut through all that and just get what needs to be done while eliminating everyone that stands in his way. And of course, reward those who've loyally followed him. And it's important to understand that there's always been something appealing particularly to right wingers about this idea, although it's not exclusive to the right. Uh, and that's why it's unsurprising that somebody like Trump would be associated with gangsters today, and sometimes proudly associated with gangsters, even by his own followers, because they embody exactly that kind of unconstrained masculine ideal.
Yeah, and it's also not just about affecting the power of the, the persecuted, the Heron folk, but it's also that when you move from when your epistemology is entirely individualist oriented, eventually it comes to that. Well, my authority figure is the source of reason and truth, and that what he says is everything. It is, the idea of the great chain of being, divine command theory,
Mhm.
that all of these things are all interrelated. That nihilism collapses into totalitarian.
Yeah, without a doubt. And sometimes they can be very express about this. As I was saying before we went on air, if you want, just read Charlie Kirk's new book, Right Wing Revolution. Now, I don't recommend reading anything by Charlie Kirk if you're looking for deep insight into most subject matters. But if you want to understand how MAGA operates, it's not a bad source. But in the most telling chapter of that book, he says, look, and he's speaking to his conservative readers, you might be beset by uncertainties at any given point, but you must militantly, and this is his term, police those uncertainties away and chase an absolute conviction that you are right wherever possible. And if you're not sure what that absolute conviction be, just look at what the left, understood very broadly, says, and you can know for sure that they are wrong. And he says what we need to do is chase a right, wrong, good or evil, Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader kind of approach to every issue possible. And he does says we should do that precisely because it's easier to market such a worldview than one that is defined by the nuanced kinds of epistemologies that you're talking about. And of course, this is very coincident with what somebody like Trump wants. Trump is the kind of guy who would sit there and very happily tell you, who do you believe, me or your lying eyes? And try to convince you that your lying eyes aren't to be trusted. But he is, right? And there are a lot of different reasons why these kinds of epistemic outlooks can be appealing to people. Uh, One of them, I think, going back to people like Eric Fromm or Adorno, is just that it's not a lot of people aren't happy about being uncertain in the world, right? Uncertainty can lead to confusion, it can lead to anxiety, and sometimes it's nice to chase certainty. Uh, but I think it's a very dangerous temptation to give in to those impulses because the world is invariably far more complicated than we'll ever be able to understand. And trying to reductively simplify it in the name of gratifying our pathological need for certainty is child and immature. And I think that that's one of the reasons why Trumpism is as childish and immature as it is.
Yeah, it is, and and related to that is that the Trump, since um, you know, as the Republican Party has become, almost entirely reactionary, and certainly in the power sense,
Trumpified, right?
100%. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as this has happened, there has been just this overwhelming brain drain among Republican operatives, among Republican. I mean, they don't even try to have policy platforms anymore. Like in 2020, famously, they had no platform at all, and then in 2024, they just kind of put a couple of wish list items, on a roughly, what was it, like a five page paper or something like that.
Mhm.
It was very, very, very small, much smaller than. And then and you see that with when Trump was in office, that he had problems getting people to work for him who had any sort of qualifications. And even Republicans didn't want to work for him because they thought that he was, just stupid, and they couldn't ever achieve anything meaningful to them. And I can say this myself, that, I was friends at that time with somebody who, because, as I think, yeah, I don't know, if you know, I'm trying to remember if I told you or not, but, like, I used to be a right-wing activist myself,
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, so, when Trump first came into office, I was friends with somebody who was one of his top speechwriters, and he offered me a job in the Trump White House,
Right.
and I thought about it for a second, only because I thought, well, there's gonna be a lot of really stupid people in there. So maybe there should be at least, one or two adults in the room. But in the end, I couldn't justify it to myself morally because I thought, well, to whatever extent I would have any influence, I would also be countenancing all kinds of horrible ideas and whatnot, and policies, and so therefore I do it. And but it's a conundrum that you're seeing not just in the policy making realm, but also in the media realm as well. That the very, very well financed, and sort of remnant, liberal reactionism, if you will, that prevailed before Trump, the neoconservative hierarchy. They still exist, but they have no influence on the party. And it's almost, I don't know. It's like, you read these people a lot. Like, do they know they don't have influence, but do you think that they think that they're ever getting it back? Um,
It's a good question. So I think in order to start answering your question, we have to understand what the relationship between intellectuals and the right is, right? So many have commented on the kind of anti-intellectual of the political right, going back again to Edmund Burke's chastisement of the kind of coffee house philosophes that he blamed largely for the French Revolution. Uh, but there's deep-rooted theoretical and practical reasons why the right would have this wariness and even hostility to intellectuals, which stamps movement like MAGA. I think two of the clearest figures that make express where this anti-intellectual impulse comes from are Joseph de Maistre and Yoram Hazony, right? So for those of your listeners who don't know, Joseph de Maistre is usually considered to be the godfather of the reactionary tradition, a fierce critic of the French Revolution, and a fierce critic of Enlightenment reason. And he's very express about why he's a critic of Enlightenment reason, because he says, look, Enlightenment reason, or what is ignorantly called philosophy, is fundamentally, and this is his term, a destructive force, right? When people are told to use their own reason to assess what society is doing, to ask themselves what kind of political authorities that they want, then what we wind up with is an endless series of debates, discussions, and deliberations about who should be in charge and why, that will go nowhere and that are toxic to the establishment of any kind of lasting authority. And so he says, very bluntly, that we need to treat existent authorities like dogmas, right? Adopt an almost religious attitude of fidelity towards them, not question the foundations of our political order all that substantially. And he pointed out in other works like the St. Petersburg Dialogues, if that doesn't work, well, the hangman or the executioner should always be available to kind of overawe anybody who might be asking too many questions about the existent order. Now, flash forward to the present day, you have intellectuals like Yoram Hazony who make very similar points, albeit less dramatically, let's call it that. Because Hazony says, look, one of the things that characterizes liberalism and the left is this endless propensity to want to engage in critical reasoning. And Hazony says there always should be a place for critical reasoning, but critical reasoning can be very destructive, right? Because it leads people to ask endless questions one after another about why we should have this authority, what were the actual facts of our history? Are there reasons to be skeptical of the longstanding traditions that we have? And he says, after a certain point, asking these questions one after another is either a waste of time or positively dangerous, which is why at a certain point, you just have to stop and take things on faith, which again has this pronouncedly anti intellectualist attitude. Uh, and you see this expressed policy wise in a lot of the hostility that the right shows towards things like, say, critical race theory or critical theory more generally, right? Because they don't want people asking this endless series of questions about their society, its history, the role of slavery in American life, and its enduring impact, because that leads to uncomfortable questions about whether existent authority structures and hierarchies have the kind of legitimacy that the right wants to ascribe to them. Now, I want to be very clear. There are enormously interesting and profound right wing intellectuals out there, going from Edmund Burke to people like Hazony or Patrick Deneen, and of course Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, the rest of the canon, right? Uh, but the right, by and large, has been a lot more wary of the role intellectuals should play in society than liberals or the left, who tend to welcome or even encourage the
yeah.
development of people's critical faculties, since many people in the liberal tradition or on the left really like this idea that we should have an endless debate about things like first principles, authority structures, hierarchies. Think about somebody like
Hmm.
John Stuart Mill, for example, the emblematic left wing liberal, right, who said, we should encourage free speech in part because we can never be sure whether our own ideas are the right one. And even if we are pretty sure that our ideas are the right ones, there's always something to learn from combating the other side. Society should be an endless and critical debate about just these kinds of things. That's a much more liberal attitude, and of course, it's much more conducive to somebody like me and my taste.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's also that core difference though that you just talked about. It is kind of a flaw, I think, in a lot of uh, left wing attempts to scrutinize right wing politics, in that they project that love of intellectual debate and such that. And they don't understand that, like, and I see this on some podcasts and articles or whatever, where they will go and analyze these people like Patrick Dedeen or whoever, and impute all kinds of influence to them when in fact they don't actually have almost any influence on Donald Trump or the people who work for him. Um,
Yeah, I mean, Donald
their
Trump is
real,
not flipping through why liberalism failed late at night and being like,
yeah,
yeah,
this guy has a point.
yeah,
No, they're not, and like, but to the extent that they have any influence, it is the reverse of how things work on the left with regard to intellectuals. That for the right, you have influence if you rationalize the ideas of the leader. Like, whereas, and it works the other way around on the left, that, what the leaders, at least supposed to are be doing on the left, is that they are, sort of effectuating the ideas of the people who created the ideas, whereas on the right, the ideas are ex post facto. They are rationalizations for the desires of the leader.
yeah, and sometimes progressive intellectuals can be quite vain for this reason, right? Just to pick on my own side a little bit, I'm a very left wing guy. John Maynard Keynes famously once said that a lot of politicians that scribble insights late at night are the slaves to some distant and long dead economist or philosopher or whatever it happens to be. And if you want to go more radical still, think about something like of organic intellectuals who gradually overcome the hegemony of capitalism and replace it with a more emancipatory culture. Now, again, these arguments are more to my taste because I do think that intellectuals have a role to play in society, but it can be very substantially overstated. But there's no doubt that the left is and liberals are considerably more receptive to intellectuals playing a pronounced role in society than the right is. Although I want to stress again, the right, certainly post 18th century, has recognized the need to have an intellectual cadre of its own to combat the seemingly ever growing, at least in its eyes, cabal of left wing intellectuals that are kind of nebulously probing holes in authority structures and hierarchies within society and need to be confronted on that terrain if necessary.
Hmm.
I mean, even look at
Um,
somebody, sorry, just
yeah.
like Thomas Sowell, who's emblematic in that respect, right? I wrote a big review of Thomas Sowell for Jacobin magazine. Some people might be interested in, but one of Thomas's biggest books is a book called Intellectuals in Society, which is a book about why intellectuals should play no role in society. Now, of course, he almost invariably singles out liberal and left intellectuals for the destructive role that they play, and chastises them for engaging in interdisciplinary sweep where not that's not warranted. Before he goes on to talk about everything from economics to history to military strategy to politics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, but this kind of oddly paradoxical stance on the part of a right wing intellectual, simultaneously chastising the influence of intellectuals in society while recognizing that he needs to exist precisely to combat left and liberal intellectuals, is very characteristic of the right.
It is, yeah, and there's also a paradox, even as, let's say, you know, philosophically, that the left is more open to the ideas of, or to intellectualism. They are less willing to actually support financially things like think tanks. So, like, for instance, if you look at on the right, there's just this multiplicity
Yeah.
of advocacy organizations that, they may not be necessarily coming out with policy papers, but at least they're making, the vague noises about policy. And there are, probably in DC alone, probably like at least 100 of these organizations with a
Yeah.
cumulative budget of probably, something like $500 million a year.
Mhm.
Whereas on the left, there's almost nothing in comparison
Yeah.
to that. Because to a large degree, I think that especially this is more true of
If I could
progressives
just
and
give you,
liberals.
one quick anecdote that makes, that kind of makes this point. Um,
Mhm,
back in the day, I used to write some articles for, the Intercollegiate Institute, which is a conservative, organization, mostly about Edmund
mhm,
Burke and, postmodern conservatism, and I just wanna say they were very nice to me, right? Despite me
mhm,
making my own orientation clear. Uh, one of the reasons I did this was I just wanted to see, like, can I actually present conservative ideas to a conservative audience in a way that would seem palatable. But I got paid about $400 an article writing for them, which is really very good. And considering how poor I was at the time, was helpful. I'll just be candid about that. Uh, I've written 50 pieces for Jacobin magazine soon. Uh, I probably made about as much for all 50 pieces as I did writing one thing for Intercollegiate Institute, right? So just to give you a sense of
yeah.
the funding dynamics there, right? And again, that's not a knock on Jacobin. They've been very happy to support my work. It's just there's no money for advancing those kinds of policies. Certainly not
Yeah,
compared to the
and
right.
yeah, and it is paradoxical because I do think that, a lot of progressives, they don't understand what the purpose of universities is, that it is not to be a factory or promulgator of progressive ideas. They don't understand that that's not what universities intend to be. And so as such, you should not outsource your political popularizing or theorizing to them because they're not going to do it. The people at the top in most universities, in fact, are conservative. And because they hobnob with billionaires and oligarchs to grow their endowments, and that's how they operate. Like these are conservative institutions inherently.
Yeah, I always think it's funny whenever sometimes I like reading conservative media because in conservative media, people like me and my friends are made out to be basically in charge of the entire world, right? We're liberal college professors, and apparently we're brainwashing generations of students into becoming, little postmodern neo-Marxists, to use the Jordan Peterson term. And
Mhm.
when I get back to the real world, I'm like, God, I can't even get people to read the Federalist Papers from beginning to end despite my sitting there being like, please, 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 this is your constitution. We need to read Madison to understand it, and your grade is dependent upon it. So I'm begging you. So, sometimes
Yeah.
it's quite flattering to imagine myself in this conservative vein, being like, oh, yeah, I'm just molding hearts and minds. Um, so, it's a kind of funny irony that way.
Yeah. Well, and JD Vance, just to bring him back in here, that he I think is he really is kind of emblematic, much more than almost any other
Mhm.
Republican politician of this reactionary sensibility has become so regnant of Trump. And he has specific personal connections to a lot of these reactionary far right thinkers,
Oh, yeah.
anti-democrats, monarchists. Can you talk about some of those connections? Because I mean, gosh, they need to be known. Like every person should know this stuff. I feel like because it's so.
Sure. Well, I mean, a lot of people have talked about how influences on JD Vance's worldview are very online kind of influences, and there's some truth to that. Listing all of them would take too much time, but just to kind of give a short list, right? He was very influenced by Peter Thiel, who he worked for a long time, and Thiel is an eclectic billionaire who likes to think of himself as an intellectual. But one of the kind of through lines to his worldview from the very beginning has been a hostility to democracy. So you can go back and read, I think it's a 2009 essay that Thiel wrote called The Education of a Libertarian, where he basically says the prospects for libertarianism in the United States, certainly post Obama, are pretty much nil. And he's very transparent that one of the reasons for this is uh, post, women be gaining the right to vote. It's just very unlikely that there's going to be a coalition to support unbridled libertarianism to roll back the New Deal, since women, in his opinion, are more likely to support left wing policies. And so he expresses a deep hostility to democracy on that basis. Because he thinks that democracy is just never going to be conducive to libertarianism. And if that's the case, in his mind at least, so much the worse for democracy. Now, of course, this is extraordinarily self-serving, and some people have pointed out, I try to characterize it as ambiguous. I don't think there's much ambiguity about a billionaire thinking that a billionaire should have more power and more influence in society. But there's no doubt that this kind of anti-democratic sentiment that's been pervasive throughout all of Pierre Thiel's permutations has stamped some of Vance's worldview. Another important person is Curtis Yarvin, our Mencius Nullbug, who was also financed, I should say, by Thiel, right? It's not clear how, but he's received a lot of money from him. So for those who don't know, really who are fortunate enough not to know, Curtis Yarvin, or Mencius Moldbug, is the monarchist that you talked about, or the neo-Marx monarchist. He started a blog in the late 2000s, essentially arguing that American society was pervasively left. It was dominated by a kind of cultural hegemony uh, associated with liberal elites that he called the cathedral. And there was really no way of breaking through this without the formation of a bunch of different dissident right intellectuals who took the red pill. He was one of the people who coined that phrase, saw through the kind of illusions that were promulgated by the left wing cathedral, and recognized that democracy and socialism and liberalism were really all species of the same kind of bad thing, this movement towards what he considers chaos. And the only way to offset that would eventually be to transition to something like a neo monarchy. Now, he has a lot of different terms and a lot of different flavors of this idea that he's put forward over decades now. But the basic idea is that somebody like once upon a time, it was Steve Jobs. Now somebody like Elon Musk should take control of the country for the most part. Reduce the influence of the people because the masses suck in his term to nil, and just do what needs to be done in order to bring economic prosperity and authoritarian order to the state. Uh, Chilling idea, right? It's important to note though that Yarvin is so reactionary that he says that he's not even anti-French and American Revolution. He's anti-English Civil War. He's a Jacobite, right? So that's how far back he wants to get. Another important influence on somebody like Vance would be Patrick Deneen, who we mentioned before. Patrick Deneen is a University of Notre Dame professor, author of a book, Why Liberalism Failed. That is actually quite an interesting book, and I think correctly diagnoses certain problems with, let's call it, classical or possessive liberalism. But since then, he's released a book called Regime Change that calls for exactly what it sounds like, right? Essentially replacing what he considers to be a decadent neoliberal elite with a conservative aristocracy, what he calls aristopopulism, that he thinks is going to be more conducive to passing legislation that'll be for the common good, which in practice is going to mean implementing social conservative policies without the kind of nebbish liberal restrictions that older conservatives would think are so important given the nature of the American Constitution and American culture. Now, there are other influences that have gone into J.D. Vance's worldview, but we'll just stop there because I think that three is enough for your audiences to be subjected to today.
Yeah. Well, and it's important to note that like he specifically cites these people by name.
Yeah.
Like
Oh,
this
yeah.
is
No, this
not
isn't
just
speculation, right?
you inferring that these are where he got his ideas from. Says this himself.
Yeah. I mean, look, Yarvin, back in the day, used to try to be a little bit more covert. I think part of that was also a marketing ploy on his part, being dark and mysterious and a dark elf, as he once used to call it, right? Kind of operating in the shadows. But these people are not shy about expressing their intellectual influences if you push them. Even take somebody like Chris Rufo, who had a dialogue with Yarvin not too long ago, right? And once you recognize that these are the people that they are looking to for inspiration, it should be concerning. Although, like you, I think it's very easy to overstate the influence these intellectuals have on shaping the worldview of somebody like, say, Donald Trump, or even shaping what somebody like JD Vance would do once he gets into office, if he gets into office. Let's pray to God he doesn't.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and speaking of God, there is uh, the there's an interesting dichotomy between a lot of these reactionary writers in that they, the position of religion vis-a-vis themselves. So Yarvin has said repeatedly over the years that he is an atheist and does
Yep.
not believe in religion and any of that stuff. Um, and but then by contrast, nearly all of these, sort of as they're, I guess, currently calling themselves, nationalist right or whatever they want to call it, national conservatism. Almost all of them are Catholic, with the one exception of Joachim Hancerny, who is Jewish.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, he says he's a Christian nationalist who is a
Yep.
Jew, by his own admission. So it's notable with all these atheists and Catholics are kind of inheriting control of the intellectual right, such as it is, um, from the neoconservatives who tended to be, you know, either Jewish or non-religious, like not atheist, but like just specifically non-religious. And then the shock troops had always been the evangelicals, and the evangelicals never have gotten a shot at the intellectual leadership. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I'm
Oh, yeah.
curious what your thoughts are on why not.
Well, I think part of the reason is that there's a long history of Catholic reactionary thought that many of these figures can draw upon in a way that there isn't quite as deep a reservoir of evangelical reactionary thought. It's definitely there, right? But it's not as sophisticated or as long-standing as what you find in right-wing Catholicism, at least. And I want to stress right-wing Catholicism, right? I know a lot of left-wing Catholics and Christians out there who would deeply resent, needless to say, being associated with somebody like Deneen or Adrian Vermeulen. But look, in terms of the role that religion is playing on the contemporary right, it's extremely varied, right? Some of these people are, without a doubt, true believers. Think about somebody again like Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vermeulen, right? Who's flirted with advocating for integralism, basically the idea that the United States and the American government should be subordinated to, or at least put on a position of equal standing with the Catholic Church, which is the arbiter of truth and goodness in the world. Probably not Pope Francis's Catholic Church, but a suitably reactionary Catholic Church, in Vermeulen's opinion. But others are just very overt about the fact that they don't personally believe in God, but they nonetheless want to advocate for a kind of social conservative Christian or Catholic morality because they feel that this is necessary to kind of bind society together and eliminate disorderly kind of libertinism, and also because they think that a commitment to Christian morality will be good in alleviating the decadence that they see as sweeping society by committing people to higher or more grand kinds of projects, which include, for instance, producing enormous numbers of children. And I suppose a third thing that we can point about that's some of the darkest strands of right wing thought out there. Many also endorse return to these kinds of religious principles because they're worried about the demographic decline or the great replacement of white Americans by non white Americans or non white immigrants. And they think that Christian morality can provide an antidote to that. And many are pretty overt about the fact, again, that they don't believe, or again, that they question whether there is a God. People like, say, Richard Spencer, one of the founders of the term alt-right, characterized himself as a cultural Christian. Douglas Murray in the United Kingdom also characterized himself as a cultural Christian. But I think Yoram Hazony had the kind of best articulation of this outlook, where in a number of essays he says, look, if you're a conservative that doesn't believe in Christianity, again, in very Kirk-like language, he says, you should kind of sideline those concerns and ask yourself whether the country would be better off committing to Christian principles and returning, as he understands it at least, to the traditions associated with that, rather than continuing on the liberal path that has led it to darkness thus far. And he says, if you do think that that's what we should do, then you should go to church, you should pray, you should essentially parrot the language of religion, even if you yourself aren't a believer. Now, to me, that's a horrific idea. And, I believe I have my own kind of religious views, but a lot of them are centered around authenticity, right? This idea that you should believe because you are wholeheartedly committed to this. The idea of taking a functionalist approach to religion or saying I'm going to kind of parrot the language of religious belief because it's useful is deeply repugnant to my left liberal outlook. Um, I draw upon people like Charles Taylor here, who's a left wing Catholic. Um, but it makes a lot of sense if you're conservative to kind of articulate this kind of vision, because you're saying, look, we just need to get as many people on board with this as possible. If you feel that we need to return to tradition, but you yourself don't believe in God, just don't worry too much about the theology of that right now. Do what needs to be done, as it were.
Yeah, and Dennis Prager is another example of
Oh
that.
yeah,
That he in fact wrote a column urging non-religious conservatives to raise your children as Christian, um, because if you don't, then they're going to become liberals. Basically, what's the crux of that column? It's a an interesting admission, inadvertent admission on his part, I think, because like that is the kind of the core threat that they feel like that they're this hierarchical authoritarian sensibility cannot survive on its own merits. Like it's so hilarious that people like Jordan Peterson or whoever are often using the phrase that that they want a marketplace of ideas, but the reality is that we their ideas were tried in the marketplace of ideas 100 years ago and
yeah.
were failed. They were rejected because they do not have philosophic or empirical merit, and so as such, they lost. And people are not interested in subscribing to those ideas because they're unsupportable. But they can't see that this is irrational fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, to paraphrase my friend Nathan Robinson, who writes for, sorry, the editor of Current Affairs, there's something deeply ironic about some of the loudest and best known people in the world constantly complaining about how their ideas are being silenced and haven't been tried yet, despite the fact that, they'll go on Joe Rogan and they have podcasts that reach millions of people. And many people try them and just don't actually happen to find them all that appealing, right? Now, I want to be clear, right? I don't think that there's anything wrong from a liberal standpoint with people living a social conservative life if that's what they so choose to do, right? And
Sure.
I know many people, back at home who find that actually very fulfilling for a wide variety of different reasons. You do you. But I agree with John Stuart Mill that people are very different in terms of what is good for them, what their personality gels with, what their aspirations are in life, and what they are going to find fulfilling. I would not find a socially conservative lifestyle fulfilling in any way, shape, or form. And I know because I was raised Roman Catholic and I tried it for a little while, and I found it very boring and spiritually unfulfilling, right? Because I'm just not that kind of personality. And I think our society needs to create space for people to pursue the vision of the good life that they think is conducive to their well-being and to their flourishing within reasonable limits, obviously, right?
Yeah, well, and so long as they don't impinge on other people's
Yeah,
ability to do so.
exactly. Like you're part of
Yeah.
your vision of the good life includes being a member of the Klan and lynching people, then no. But, if you want to fast for 40 days and go to mass 5 times a week and listen to it only in Latin, then by all means do so, right? Perhaps you find something fulfilling in perhaps you find something fulfilling in that I simply do not or simply have not recognized yet.
Yeah, and that's what actual freedom looks like. And it's um yeah, and there's this like you mentioned Eric Fromm, he wrote a whole book called Escape from Freedom.
Yep.
And that like that's what a lot of this is that freedom to a reactionary is imposing their opinions on someone else. Like they don't and Tony Perkins, who is the founder of the Family Research Council, or at least the president, I'm sorry, of the Family Research Council, he had said that if we cannot legislate our opinions in society, we don't have freedom, which is inherently, anti-liberal and frankly anti-American. Uh,
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, Adrian Vignole is probably the one who's most express about that, where he's consistently declaimed that his religious liberty is violated if he's not allowed to pass legislation, or people like him aren't allowed to pass legislation restricting LGBTQ rights. Now, I do think
mhm.
that democratic freedom or social freedom, if you want to call it that, is a kind of freedom, right? So, to a certain extent, he's not wrong, and I think as liberals we should acknowledge that, right? But the question then becomes: is what is more important to a society committed to liberty? Adrian Vimiole's right to pass religious legislation that is going to restrict people's basic liberties to love who they want, or people's liberty to love who they want, right? Without interfering with anyone else. And I think that's a very, very easy question to answer, right? Um, because Vermeulen can very easily live the kind of social conservative lifestyle that he wants within a liberal society, while complaining about how he can't pass legislation to discriminate on the basis of his prejudices. But LGBTQ persons would not be able to live in a Vermeulean society and love the kind of people that they love. And it's not a hard question for me, which is of those societies is more committed to freedom at all.
Yeah. And it's been interesting to see the Democratic Party actually finally starting to make that argument under Kamala Harris
Yeah,
as the candidate that freedom. This is the first time in decades that that had been a theme at a Democratic political convention, and it's a welcome development in my opinion.
it is right. And look, I have my problems with Kamala Harris. You know, I'm a Bernie guy, but I do welcome this transition to a kind of rhetoric of joy and optimism that you've seen in her campaign. Uh, I mean, part of this is I think is that Biden, just because of his age, did himself a disservice by constantly focusing on the threat that Trump posed to democracy, because it really kind of cast this atmosphere of doom, gloom, and decline around the Democratic Party that because Biden was so old was not really a great look. Let's just call it that. Uh, but I think that fundamentally Americans, and this is a point that my good friend Alexander Lefebvre makes in his Liberalism as a Way of Life, are committed to a kind of comprehensive liberal worldview. They find sustenance and meaning in being liberal, and liberalism can be a very joyous philosophy in many ways. Uh, it's a glass half full kind of outlook in many cases, although it's not naive about human nature. And that's why I think many people, certainly after decades of Trumpism, find this rhetoric of joy resonant. Because I think that people want to look forward to the future and they want to think that their tomorrow is going to be better than today. And when they're constantly confronted by politicians that say everything is bad and everything is trash and everything needs to be changed, it can become a bit of a downer and become a bit exhausting after a certain point. Probably the most emblematic moment for me, at least with the NC campaign, is when Barack Obama went up and gave a speech and he talked about Trump and he's like, you know, Trump's shtick is getting a bit old, isn't it? And as somebody who's been writing about Trump now for the better part of a decade and has 2 books out on postmodern conservatism, I can say I'm pretty much done talking about it, and then people can move on to something else, right?
Yeah. Well, and ultimately, the reorientation toward freedom and joy, like that is political parties and ideologies do best when when their message aligns with their core emotional and psychological argument. So
Yeah.
that what it boils down to is that hope is progressive and despair and nihilism is reactionary. And Biden kind of disrupted that by departing.
Oh, without a doubt, right? The moment I thought, I mean, I've done a crystal ball, but I figured that Biden was gonna win in 2020, was, when, Trump was attacking him. I think it was in the first debate, over Hunter Biden, and Biden just sat there and he's like, "Look, my son struggles a lot. He's all right, and I'm proud of him for doing that." I thought to myself, the country right now, not even America, but the world, is going through a horrible pandemic. Many of us are very anxious about what the future, pretends. I was living in Canada at that point, and my grandmother, who was 86, was like, "I've never seen anything like this before," right? And there was something that was ordinary and comforting about this kind of outlook because he just seemed like a normal guy who was proud of his son, a little bit worried that was going around. And he hit a note that really worked with the message that the Democratic Party needed to hit at that point, which is that things are bad right now, but they're going to be okay. And we're going to get through this. Right. And that was a fine message in 2020, but it's 2024 now. And comfort coupled with doom and gloom and apocalyptic anxieties about democracy, even if I share a lot of those anxieties, isn't what we should be going for. People, I think, want something to look forward to. They want to believe in politics again. And I don't know if the Harris campaign is going to be successful in pulling that off, right? There's still 2 months before we
Yeah.
get the election. But they seem to be doing a pretty good job so far, right? And again,
Mm.
though I have deep reservations about the Harris candidacy that stem from my own leftism, certainly I prefer her to be in office to Donald Trump. So,
Yeah.
that's what,
Well,
I want to see happen.
yeah. Well, and just wrapping it up here, like this idea of hope and despair and sort of the mutual collaboration between atheist reactionaries and Christian authoritarians. A lot of this it derives from, or at least is sensible to the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche and who was, of course, famously not religious himself. Um, but a lot of people who haven't actually read
Don't
him.
don't tell that shockingly to the expansive number of right-wing Christians, so-called, who seem to find a great deal of value in Kirk's work. I wrote an article about this for the Institute for Christian Socialism, but it's truly baffling to me that people like Jordan Peterson or Charlie Kirk or Jonah Goldberg will all cite Nietzsche extraordinarily positively while calling themselves Christian thinkers, or at least beholden to a kind of Christian ethic, seemingly unaware of the fact that Nietzsche despised Christianity, characterized himself as the Antichrist, partly ironically,
Yeah,
partly sincerely, and also famously once said that it was socialism and liberalism and democracy that they're the clearest descendants of the Christian worldview, albeit secularized in the contemporary era. Anyway, sorry, just go on. Just a bone that I always have to pick.
yeah. Well, and it's like the the fundamental point for Nietzsche as a non-religious reactionary was that uh, oh, religion was the only thing or at least religious hierarchy was the only thing that was standing between, the emaciated, denuded uh, slop of liberal democracy and the great imagined past, which he believed that humanity had departed from. And ultimately is why I think that, so many non-religious reactionaries have decided, well, I think these doctrines are nonsense, but I'm going to get behind these guys because at least to paraphrase the dude, at least it's an ideology.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the rise of what I and others have called the Nietzschean right, certainly intellectually, is a very intriguing development in American circles. Although, as one wit put it, a lot of American conservatives seem to have traded not reading Locke, but talking a lot about Locke for not reading Nietzsche and talking a lot about Nietzsche. I think that the American Nietzschean right now uh, fundamentally doesn't really take on board a lot of Nietzsche's distinctive ideas, actually. And this relates back to my earlier point about people like Peterson or about people like Kirk, or even for that matter, people like Douglas Murray, right? Who will draw on certain Nietzschean tropes about resentment without taking a lot of the more interesting material on board. Uh, but fundamentally, what they are intrigued by is this Nietzschean insistence that people are fundamentally different, and they are different in a way that makes them unequal, right? Some people are more worthwhile and more valuable than others. And that's very conducive to a wide array of right wing thinkers who will want to divide the world up according to IQ, or divide the world up according to a racial hierarchy, or divide the world between men and women, with men put on top, or all of the above, right? Many of the people who are sympathetic to the one are sympathetic to the other two as well, right? And we can go on and on and on. And it's deeply funny because rather like how Nietzsche would have been appalled at how fascists banalized his ideas in this kind of populist way, there's no doubt that he would have found it both very funny and deeply frustrating that his work was so profoundly banalized by a lot of what the Nietzschean right in America right now is doing. But perhaps that's the inevitable legacy or the inevitable endpoint of any intellectual who comes up with a sufficiently interesting set of ideas. Eventually, they're going to wind up with proponents and disciples who are just caricatures of what those ideas once stood for. And I think that's what you see right now.
Yeah, and it is important to note also, to be fair, that there are, quite a few people who do read their Nietzsche as being in favor of socialism and progressive values in some sense or another, and that they will. And there's an argument to be made, and in fact has been made about that the posthumous writings of his were edited by his sister, who was
Yeah.
basically a Nazi, and she distorted their meaning. So I do want to make sure to point that out.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
I just want to be clear about this because there's actually people, much like people aren't really aware of some of the interscene intellectual debates that go on in the American right. There's not a lot of transparency on some of the quite nebbish and highly hyper intellectualized debates that go on the American left. But right now, the American left, indeed the worldwide left, is going through a kind of process of de-Nietzscheification. So if you're like me and you're a millennial, You probably went to college and you would read people like Michel Foucault or Gilles Deleuze, for example, who were kind of left wing Nietzscheans, right? I mean, Foucault was very overt about that, right? He said in an interview, "I am a Nietzschean,"
Yeah.
and you might have just assumed that Nietzsche is fundamentally a left wing thinker because he's anti bourgeois. He's got a very punk mentality, and he really advocates for these kind of grand, sweeping transformative projects, right? That you might associate with a certain kind of leftism. But recently, there's been a lot of intellectual work done by people like Daniel Tutz, myself, I should add, Domenico Lacerdo, Malcolm Bull, Ron Biener, Nancy Love. We've all written books talking about how, well, yes, Nietzsche was interested in being anti-bourgeois. Yes, he was also interested in these big transformative projects, but he was also very insistent that an aristocratic society, indeed a radically aristocratic society, was the only kind of setting where these kinds of changes could take place. And he was very, very prone to saying things like, hey, slavery would be a good idea, right? Uh, all these kinds of ideas that would be fundamentally hostile to the left. So it's a very interesting conversation that's going on the left in American society right now. As many people who once upon a time were weird in left wing flavors of Nietzscheanism become increasingly hostile to the guy. And I don't know where that's going to go, but it's not something I would have predicted back in the 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is interesting to see, and I do think that that sort of debate also is why you have seen some people, aside from the fact that they can get massively rich
Yeah.
from flattering Trumpist fascism, like Matt Taibbi or some of these other people that they did have kind of this more that they were on the left if they were ever at all, but let's say they were if they were on the left, it was only because of the anti-bourgeois sensibility. And then eventually, once they realized, oh, well, Donald Trump and his supporters hate America also. And so, hey, we're going to go over there.
Yeah. And actually, this is a good place to wrap up because this is why I wrote a book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, that's coming out soon, right? To kind of stress to my fellow leftists and my fellow liberals that there's a deep elective affinity between the two traditions that makes them quite different from what you find on the right. Now, I just want to be clear, right? Horseshoe theory, as it's sometimes called, I think is a very bad way of looking at the world, partly for the reasons I
Yeah,
just
me too.
mentioned, right? But there is no doubt a certain kind of intellectual or just a certain kind of personality that is fundamentally anti-liberal and anti-bourgeois and can shift, usually from left to right, although not always. And the one constant that remains in their outlook is this kind of anti-liberal mentality, right? Think about somebody like Sohrab Ahmari, who I had a debate with in December
Yeah.
2023, right?
He
Uh,
actually blocked me on Twitter because he's a cowardly piece of shit.
well,
But go
actually,
ahead.
Sarb and I got along pretty well, right? But similar kind of attitude towards certain things. Although I'm very liberal, and he's certainly not. But you see that in his transition, right? He went from being a kind of hardened leftist, interested in Trotsky and Foucault and all these things, to a very reactionary Roman Catholic, and now he seems to have put the two together. And he'll write a book about you know why we should combine Marx with you know, Adrian Vermeulen, and reactionary Catholicism and see what we can get, right? And the constant through line, of
Mhm.
course, is the kind of anti-liberal mentality. So definitely not impossible. And there's definitely personalities that are like that. But just to your listeners, horseshoe theory is not a good way of looking at the world. And I think that a lot of centrist commentators rely on this idea that if you go too far left, you eventually end up right, or too far right, you eventually end up left, in lieu of serious analysis of what makes these different ideologies discrete.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's less about the ideologies and more about the psychology. Uh, is how I would. But yeah, all right. So, well, you have plug. So, when is your book? This other book that you were talking about here? When's that?
Yeah, sure. So my book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, is coming out late November, right? If people want to check it out, they can pre-order it on Amazon or on the Routledge website. And I imagine, for a lot of your listeners, there might be a little bit of wariness about the socialist label. But one of the things that I point out is that there are many constructive and liberal forms of socialism out there, just like there are many forms of emancipatory and egalitarian liberalism out there. And I think it's very worthwhile to put the two traditions into dialogue with one another since both are ultimately Enlightenment doctrines that are committed to humanism, reason, and liberty, equality, and solidarity for all. And there's a lot to be gained by dialogue with one another. And frankly, what could be more liberal than that?
Yeah. And then the other book, which has kind of sort of been the subtext of the discussion of this episode today, that you've got, which is already available and has been for a little bit. It's called The Political Right and Equality: Turning Back the Tide of Egalitarian Modernity. And then on social media, where are you posting that for people who want to keep tabs with you there?
Sure, people can add me at Matt Paul Prof on Twitter. Uh, I'm never going to call it X, and the more Elon Musk insists that I call it X, the more it's going to be Twitter. I can be spiteful that way. Or people can email me at mattmcmanus300 at gmail.com. And I do my best to get in touch with people by email if they reach out to me.
Okay, sounds good. And I will commend people to do that. So thanks for joining me today, and we'll stay in touch. I look forward to it.
Yeah, thanks, man. Good conversation.
All right. So that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the discussion. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show. You can get the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And my special thanks to everybody who is a paid subscribing member. You get full unlimited access to the archives of the program. And I also encourage everybody to go to flux.community, where you can get access to all the other programs and articles that we produce at Flux. And I appreciate everybody who is supporting us in that way. And I'll see you next time.